Out of all the books of the Old Testament, I think Job has to be one of my favorites. At the very least, it's a top 5. It's a fascinating book because it records a fascinating story about a man named Job. Job is someone who is wealthy. He's someone who's righteous. He's someone who is loving. He loves his family and he loves his God. And he is an outstanding, well-respected man within his community. And yet in one season of his life, he finds himself the object of an immense amount of suffering. He experiences an immense amount of evil and suffering of which he cannot understand. And this is the story of Job, about an innocent man who, having experienced an immense amount of evil, he wrestles with his God, the God who he loves, the God who he's always had a relationship with. He wrestles with God, trying to make sense of how it could be the case that he, an innocent man, can suffer as much as he does. So the story of Job pushes its readers, not least modern readers, to come to terms with existential issues. It forces us to ask the deep questions of life. Questions such as, why is there suffering? More specifically, why do innocent people suffer? Why do essentially godly people, blameless people like Job, go through the amount of suffering and evil that they actually do? And another question that comes up in the story of Job that philosophers have long wrestled with is the question of God's relationship to human suffering and the evil that exists in the world. What is God's role in the suffering of people? It doesn't take long to realize. Just turn it on CNN or Fox News or one of the major news stations, and it doesn't take long to realize that the world is out of whack. The world is disorderly. Right now, in fact, the whole world is at a standstill due to the coronavirus pandemic. A lot of people are losing their lives as we speak. So the problem of evil is a problem for all human beings, for all mortals, people like you and people like me. I think that's what makes the story of Job so relevant. It's always a timely story, right? Well, in this video, what I want to do is introduce us to the story and introduce us to the main or the first section of the story, and in another video we'll continue this discussion. But in this video, we're just going to get ourselves into the waters a bit and look around and assess the landscape, as it were. But before we get into the meat of it all, I want to make a comment or two about the overall structure of the book of Job and, just the book of Job itself. First, a lot of scholars understand the book of Job to be some sort of poetic literary piece. I think one scholar has called it an epic poem. And it is a remarkable literary piece as well. It's, as you know, part of the Old Testament books of the Bible that are considered wisdom or poetic literature. And so Job finds itself within those categories of Old Testament books. As I said, it's a book that philosophers might find very interesting, and indeed many philosophers through the years have found the book of Job to be very interesting. And you'll see why more in a moment. But okay, as for the overall structure of the book of Job, scholars divide the book up in different ways. For our purposes, I think it's best to simply see the book of Job as being comprised of 3 sections, right? In other words, you can divide the book of Job up into 3 basic sections. So the first section would be what we call the prologue. This is the introduction to the book, and it's chapters 1 and 2. So Job chapters 1 and 2 is the prologue. I think the prologue is the most important part of the book, to be honest with you. Because without the prologue and without the events that are recorded in the prologue, the rest of the book simply will not make sense. In fact, it would leave us despairing, and it would leave us without more answers that we need. Not to suggest that the prologue gives us every answer that we're wanting. Far from it. The entire book of Job doesn't answer every philosophical question we have about suffering and about God's role as sovereign God in light of our suffering. There's still going to be a lot of mystery left to those questions, but all the same, the prologue does go a long way in helping us to at least come to terms with more of a right view of those questions and finding answers to those questions. Okay, so the first part of the book of Job is the prologue, chapters 1 and 2. The second part of the book is the largest part of the book. It's the largest section, and it's comprised of chapters 3 all the way to chapter 42, verse 9. Now, this section is what we might call the dialogues and the discourses. As I said, this is the largest section of the book of Job because in this section, Job is crying out to God. He's arguing with God at times. He's saying a lot of things about God, that some of which are not true, though. Based on the information that he has at the time, we're not gonna blame him too much, right? It also records the discussions that Job has with his crazy friends. So after Job begins to suffer, his friends do what any friend would do. They show up at his house and they sit with him, and they minister to him by just being silent and sitting with him. And that's important, right? When we're suffering, we don't always need answers. We don't need conversations. We just need the presence of a loved one. And to their credit, Job's friends do a good job with respect of just showing up and being present with their friend as he's suffering. And things don't go bad until they start opening their mouths, right? As soon as they start giving him advice and telling him what to do and showing off their wisdom, that's when things go south. Job's friends, they don't do a good job at all in helping him make sense of his sufferings. In fact, they do a lot of harm, and at the end of the story of Job, God reprimands them, right? Okay, so that's the second section. The third section is just simply the epilogue, the ending, the conclusion, the wrap-up of the whole story. And this section is chapter 42, verses 10 to 17. And the epilogue just records how things end. So Job goes through a period of suffering, and at the end, in the epilogue, his story takes a turn for the better. I wouldn't say that his story becomes completely better, but his story, it has a decent ending, right? This is one thing I love about the story of Job, is that it's a real story, right? In the sense that it's something that we can really relate to. It's an honest story, and by the way, I hate movies, particularly some Christian movies, right, that end perfectly, as if the ending is riding off into the sunset, and on your way you're stopping to smell flowers, right? Life just doesn't always work like that. When human beings go through periods of suffering, and when human beings go through periods of deep trial and anguish, things might get better, but there's still wounds that we carry on sometimes for the rest of our lives. Not always, but for many people who go through periods of suffering, even when they recover, there still may be some wounds and scars. And I think in the story of Job, even though in the end things turn out better for him, better in the sense of he got past the bad stuff, right? They're not whole. It's not complete. He still ends up having to bury many of his loved ones, and they don't get resurrected back, right? They stay dead, and he gets a new family, but there's something about that's bittersweet. And I think that's very human, right? So that's the overall structure of Job. That's something that we want to keep in mind as we seek to understand the way the story works. So you have the prologue, then you have the dialogues and the discourses, and then you have the epilogue.